everyone. I'm super excited to be here today. I'm going to talk to you about data. Obviously, this is a very popular topic right now. Ollie just gave a great presentation on data as well. Although I feel like a lot of times when people in our industry talk about data, we're talking about how to use it to basically help us make decisions. And what I want to talk about is more how I've used data to help inform opportunities or identify opportunities for myself as both a designer and a manager. And I'm going to talk through 3 different examples of how I've done that at my current job at BuzzFeed. So first, as a disclaimer, I'm going to talk about data, but I am not a data scientist. I'm a designer, and I have been for most of my career. I started out working, designing a lot of software for financial institutions, doing a lot of like small business accounting stuff and online payments. Then I got a job working at a small startup in the television industry, and then that sort of helped lead me to my current role at BuzzFeed. I joined there as a designer working on the BuzzFeed iOS app, and then sort of worked my way up to manage a team of designers working on newer apps at our company. And currently, I lead a team of designers that are focusing on internal tools for our video producers. And some of the examples I'm going to talk about are going to touch on both these internal tools as well as our mobile apps that we've worked on. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about BuzzFeed in case people aren't familiar with the company. If you are, you've probably recognized this from a post on Facebook. Maybe you've seen one of our videos on YouTube. Chances are, if you've been on the internet in the last year, you've probably stumbled on something BuzzFeed has created. So a lot of people think of us as a media company, and yet others might also describe us as a tech company because we are very data-driven, and we do build a lot of proprietary technology. Others still might call us more of an advertising agency because we were one of the first media companies to sort of pioneer the idea of native advertising. And the reality is we're really all of these things combined, all of the above. The way that we define ourselves internally is as a cross-platform global network for news and entertainment. And we try to leverage that proprietary technology that we build in-house to continuously test, learn, and optimize our content and our site itself. So data is definitely in our blood at BuzzFeed. And I'm just going to read off a few stats about the company. So monthly, we generate about 7 billion content views, which are coming from about 200 million unique users. And this is, our content is coming from, or is published on across 30 different social networks. So Facebook, Instagram, Vine, as well as several regional social networks. And this is, of course, in addition to BuzzFeed.com and our mobile apps. And we also publish content in about 6 different languages and have 11 foreign editions where content is made specifically for certain regions. And of course, about 70% of our traffic is coming from a mobile device. So whether that's the app or just visiting a page through mobile Facebook or something like that. So hopefully this gives you a sense of the scale at which we operate, and this is why we're able to collect a lot of data. However, the examples I'm going to talk about today, you can pretty much put into practice regardless of how big your company is or how much traffic you're pulling in. So I'm going to get back to the data part. So my relationship with data before BuzzFeed was a little terse. I think that there is a lot of tension between design and data. So in the past, I used to feel like data was sort of like shushing my opinion as a designer. Some of you might be familiar with this anecdote about Google, where there was a team that couldn't decide between 2 different shades of blue, so they tested 41 shades instead. And that sort of environment can be a little demoralizing as a designer. Sometimes you feel like, well, if we can just test every single option available, then why do you even need me? Why do you even need a designer? And the thing is that you do still need a designer because there are certain values that companies and businesses care about that can't be quantified, or they're not quantifiable. And another thing that sort of built my distrust around data initially was that I would see it being used to justify sort of bad UX practices, or things that I would call dark UX patterns. And a dark UX pattern is basically a design pattern that's intentionally deployed to manipulate users into taking a certain action. Maybe the user didn't intend to take it, but it might be better for the business. And this sort of happens when businesses focus entirely on their bottom line. So how much money they're making, maybe there's like a certain metric they care about, and not really focusing on how the user feels about what just happened. So a really good example of this is this modal by Netflix. This is a few years old, and they have updated it since. But what you might notice on this modal is that there's no obvious way to dismiss it. There's only one clear call to action, and that's to connect your Facebook account. But what if I don't want to do that? How do I get rid of this? It takes a lot. Actually, took me like 5 minutes when I first encountered this to figure out how. And there is a really tiny gray circle with an X in it in the far corner. And the thing is, this is a very intentional design decision to basically make it so that it's not obvious and you do have to click the big blue button and connect your Facebook account just to move on from this screen. And while I'm sure that led to an increase in the amount of people clicking the button, you also have to wonder, well, how many people then went back into Facebook and tried to disable the permissions? A lot of times I feel like the dark UX practices are justified by focusing only on one metric at the beginning of a conversion funnel and not really the subsequent steps. And another example of this is at one of the finance companies that I worked at. So we had a mobile app, and this is sort of what the onboarding flow looked like. We put the call to action to move forward in the sign-up process in the top right. So users were just kind of tapping in the top right, moving along, and then they get to the last screen, and we swapped out next or done for a call to action that says invite all. And basically what tapping this does is it sends a text message to every single person in your address book with a link to download the app. And so many people tap this because they're just already in the habit. That's pretty prime real estate on a mobile app for an action. And of course, at first, looking at the data, this looked great. Wow, so many people are sending invites. This is fantastic. But of course, if you actually kind of go down the line and look at how many of those invites actually convert to downloads and subsequent signups, it's pretty low because the intent was never there. And I think if we pay attention to the qualitative data we're seeing as well, so user feedback on some of our social channels, you can really see that this is a real problem. It's building a lot of distrust for our brand. People think that it's spam, and they actually think that we tricked them into doing this, which is awful. So basically, I think that my point here is to really make sure to look at the qualitative as well as the quantitative. And that's going to play into my first example about how we use data for user experience at BuzzFeed. So back in 2015, we launched a new app that focuses specifically on our news content. The idea is every day if you open this app, you get a curated feed of the top news stories. There's previews for longer articles if you want to read them, associated links on different topics, and just trying to break down complex political news into something more digestible. So when we first launched this is what it looks like here. You'll see this feed with all this different content on it. And when we first launched this, what we noticed was that a lot of people weren't even making it halfway down this feed. As you can see, it's still going as I'm talking. It's pretty long. Not a lot of people are making it halfway, let alone to the bottom of the feed, which means the second half of content nobody's reading. And that made the editors of the app feel very self-conscious about actually adding stories to the feed. So in a way, that was their initial reaction to the data was, oh, we should not put as much stuff in here, which is, I think, a good instinct, but kind of sad at the same time. So we thought maybe there's a design solution to this where we can still use design to encourage people to continue scrolling, to read the entire feed, and not have to sacrifice content. And our first instinct, or the first thing that we decided to try, was just adding a simple badge to the bottom of the feed that indicates how many stories you haven't read left in the feed. So we ran a simple A/B test, and we did see some improvements by having this badge there. Not a huge improvement in getting to the end of the feed, but a pretty significant improvement in people making it at least halfway. And I think if we just looked at this, we could probably say, okay, this seems good. This is a success. We can stop here. We made some improvements. But again, we looked at the qualitative data. So this is from both Facebook and Twitter. And turns out a lot of people really hated this badge idea. They did tap on it, or they did continue to read because the badge was there, but they felt like it was another inbox that they had to manage. And some people mentioned that it was just very anxiety-inducing. So it works because it preys on human psychology and our desire to complete things and get to inbox zero. But that's not necessarily a good thing for users, even though it might be good for us. And so knowing this data, we, as a design team, we sort of went back to the drawing board and we came up with 3 different ideas, which I think are so much better than just a badge at the bottom of the feed. Like some of the ideas we played around with was, well, what if you tap on one of the headlines and everything sort of contracts like an accordion and you can quickly scan all of the day's headlines and topics. We also did a simplified version of that in the middle where it's just a menu that comes out from the side and you can skip around to the topics you want to read rather than having to scroll manually through everything. And what we ended up shipping was the one on the far left there, where basically if there are multiple stories attached to a certain topic, we're de-emphasizing the everything past the first story. So only people who are interested in that story can they can use the horizontal scroll to read more, but they don't have to spend pages scrolling through vertically to get to the next story. And I think all of these they were much more fun to work on from a design perspective than just adding a badge, and I think they're also much more elegant solutions than just the badge itself. Oops, sorry. Cool, so my takeaway from that example is to basically encourage teams to stop looking at data as simply a way to pick a winner and more of an idea to identify opportunities for improvement or to push yourselves even further and explore more. And the same idea around identifying opportunity plays into my next example, which is how we've used data to improve team processes and culture internally. So I mentioned earlier that I focus now on internal tools for video producers. This is a pretty new team. We started in March. It's a new initiative at the company. And one of the first things that we did as the design team on this team was we wanted to just understand what the existing processes looked like for the team that we're designing for. So the designers put together this really great diagram that details every step of the video production process at BuzzFeed. And this diagram is really great in that it just really helps give us a clear idea of what's going on and helping our understanding of the process. But where it sort of fails is that it doesn't really tell us what's good and what's bad about this process. But luckily, at the same time, one of our designers had gone to a conference and he learned about this concept called emotional mapping. It's coined by a designer named Nathan Shedroff, so I'm sure you guys can Google that for more information on him. But the idea behind emotional mapping is that you're not just mapping out the user journey over time, you also have this y-axis that indicates how their emotional state changes over time. And we thought that this was a really great concept that we should apply to that previous diagram. But one of the kind of questions that we had was, well, where do we get the data to even inform what their emotional state is? We don't want to just make assumptions about what they like and what they don't like. And I think even if we talk to them one-on-one, I felt like we'd still be sort of generalizing. So what we came up with was basically we made this blank template of the original diagram. We took out all the information in it. Our only demarcation of time is just from when a video goes live to whatever happens before that. And we have a standardized y-axis. And we standardized that so that people would use the same words to describe their emotional state, and we weren't getting different descriptions from different people. And the idea here was that video producers would basically fill this out. We'd ask them to walk us through their process and plot each point in their process on this diagram. And this actually ended up being a really great framework for having a discussion about their work. We learned that people have a lot of feelings and a lot of emotions about their process. Well, so here's some examples of what this looks like from people actually filling this out. And like I said, I think it was a great framework for the discussion because we were actually able to understand where certain tasks fell relative to other tasks versus a one-on-one conversation where a producer might say, like, I don't like this and I don't like that. This kind of allows us to see, like, well, is that you don't like it because it's a minor annoyance, or is this actually the worst part of your process? And what you'll see as I click through these is there's kind of a pattern emerging where, well, it's definitely an emotional roller coaster is how I would describe the video production process. There's a lot of ups and downs, but they're actually pretty consistent what the ups and downs are. So this looks insane, but this is everything layered on top of each other. And if we really study it, well, first of all, we see that there is this like roller coaster wave line happening. And what we realized is everything at the top, everything that they love are the creative parts of their job. They love writing, they love shooting videos, and they love editing videos. And once a video goes public, there's sort of this big satisfaction with what they've worked on going live. So these are all the good parts. We don't want to really touch this. We don't want to mess with it. And everything that sort of sinks to the bottom of the diagram are all the manual tasks in their process. Things like booking equipment and booking time in different sets is like a logistical nightmare. There's a process towards the end we call packaging, which is basically once the video is made, a producer has to go make different versions for Facebook, for YouTube. They have to make multiple thumbnails for all these different platforms. And they have to basically fill in a form that says what video footage they used, if they use stock footage, if they use stock music, who's in the video, is there external talent. It's basically just a data entry nightmare, and they hate it. And then, again, at the very end, there's an archiving process, which is after the video is live, they have to go back into their source files and reorganize everything so that if someone else needed to use that in the future, they can. And not surprisingly, they hate that too. I mean, as a designer, I also hate that part of the process. But the cool thing here is that, like, because we identified these things, we actually did choose to focus on packaging as our first order of business to sort of fix that process for them. So we're trying to basically automate as much of that data entry as possible. And I'm hoping that when we do this exercise again at the end of the year, this deep valley at that area will be a lot more shallow. Like, I don't think we'll ever make packaging a delightful thing for anyone, but we can certainly make it more neutral. And myself and the other managers on this team, we thought, oh, that was such a cool technique and very informative for us when it came to understanding our users, that we thought we should also try the same exercise with the actual team that's been working on the projects. I mentioned we were a new team, so after 3 months of working together, we basically made the same sort of template and gave it to all the designers, the engineers, product managers that work within this team. And on the on the x-axis, we sort of have these major benchmarks that represent like what our team has done over time. So when we started and we became a team, it was actually the result of an internal reorg. I don't know if anyone here has experienced internal reorgs, but they can definitely be very anxiety-inducing. You go from being on a team that you love, that you know how to work with, and now you have to learn how to work with new people, and that can definitely not be great. And so these are all pretty consistent in that when this reorg happened, everyone was feeling pretty crappy about it. Confusion, ambiguity. This one's my favorite. There's the cliff of uncertainty followed by what's going on here. But then, obviously, as we hit some of our major milestones as a team, you can see that the atmosphere is starting to shift, the mood is getting better, and we're building momentum as a team. And some of these diagrams also highlight some small things that we did as a team that I think when we did them, we didn't realize how impactful they were on the team's mood. For example, here it says Video API Tech Talk. So basically, members of our team presented their work in front of the entire tech organization. And what we realized was like, this is like super empowering. We should definitely do this more often because it's helping to build team morale. And it's also cool because we get to learn a little bit more about people's personal lives. Like we see, like, you know, vacations are important. Someone had their marriage on the chart as something really awesome that happened to them in this time. So yeah, and this one I think is a lot more clear than the other example, but there's definitely like a general pattern. Kind of looks like a Nike swoosh for some reason. But basically what we're taking away from this is that, you know, reorgs are going to happen. Like BuzzFeed changes a lot internally because we try to respond to what's going on in the world. And we need to be better about how we communicate reorgs and how we set up new teams for success so we can sort of alleviate some of that anxiety. So my takeaway here is basically that companies that claim to be data-driven should also really focus on how they can use data internally to sort of basically like democratically influence process by giving a voice to people on their teams. And then my last example, I'm going to talk a little bit about data for authenticity and how that's sort of changing the face of journalism, since of course BuzzFeed is a media company as well. So prior to the rise of social media, Basically, a lot of what we read about in the papers or saw on cable television was dictated by a select group of writers and editors. They basically decide what the public should care about. But ever since the rise of social media, people, like everyday people, have had a voice in sort of influencing what the media should actually report on. So there's sort of been this change in structure that I would describe as media becoming more reactive to the public. And a really good example of this is around early 2015, there was this hashtag called I Look Like an Engineer. It was started by a female software engineer. She published a post on Medium, and it went viral, and soon went viral on Twitter because all these other software engineers from around the world were sharing photos of themselves and writing about their experiences as female engineers. And basically, this got so popular that almost every online media company ends up reporting it and sort of signal boosting this story even further. And what's interesting about this story to me is that if this had been written maybe like 10 years ago and a media company wanted to write about engineering, most likely they would have written about it from a male perspective, because I think that's definitely the general assumption about what software engineers are and what they look like. But social media sort of allowed people to sort of make noise and generate attention for themselves and like push the issues that we care about into the world. And obviously, like one of the major criticisms with social media chatter is that how do you identify the signal from the noise? What's actually important versus what just a lot of people are talking about? And I think one of the views that we have at BuzzFeed is actually that sometimes the noise is more interesting than the signal. Like the signal is an interpretation, but the noise is a first-hand account of what's going on. And a really good example of this is the crisis in Ferguson, which have happened around 2014 and 2015. So Ferguson is a town in America, sort of at the hotbed of a lot of racial tensions right now in America. And this crisis started after a police officer shot an unarmed black teenager. And this is one of many cities where this is happening, but this was the first one to actually get national attention. And a lot of that is because of social media. And what's interesting is that it took 2 days after the actual incident where this happened for any mainstream media companies to report on the incident at all. Meanwhile, on Twitter, the day of the incident, there are 120,000 tweets using the hashtag Ferguson, which again basically influenced the mainstream media to actually address this issue and report on it. But this is evidence to why a lot of people actually feel like now Twitter is one of their #1 news sources. You can get information faster, and you can also get more authentic information. A lot of the people commenting in that hashtag the day of were actually based in Ferguson. They were neighbors and protesters. And I think there's something much more authentic about that perspective than a removed reporter who sort of comes in 2 days later and like surveys the scene and gives their interpretation of the event. And so my takeaway here is basically that the modern media company can act as a megaphone for historically marginalized voices and sort of amplify these first-hand accounts over second-hand interpretation. And similar to how I mentioned that data can be used to democratize internal process, data can also be used to basically democratize journalism and sort of dictate what the media should be reporting on. Cool. So the last thing that I kind of want to touch on is just this idea that while data can feel really prescriptive, like, oh, this is what the A/B tests were, so we have to go with this result, I think that's actually not true at all. Like, it's really more of a mechanism for identifying opportunity, and there is a lot of room for creativity. In fact, I think that really truly data-driven companies move very fast and are very experimental. And the reason for that is if you care about data, then you want to collect it as soon as possible. You don't want to like design something and sort of shield it away from the public for 9 months, only to get data, after 9 months are over when it goes live and learn that that thing didn't actually work. So one of the things we really care about at BuzzFeed is this idea of experimenting and putting things out in the public as soon as possible, even if they're not fully realized. So this is a live video of an exploding watermelon. It was it was the most successful live video that we've ever streamed on Facebook. But what's important to know is it was not the first live video that we ever did. In fact, earlier that week, the video producers in LA, they were sort of experimenting around playing with Facebook Live, which was a new platform. And they had this idea to basically prank their boss by filling his office with baby goats while he was in meetings. And they basically just let the live stream run in his office. And he kept getting delayed, their boss. Like, he had all these meetings. And we realized, like, as he was delayed, our viewers actually kept increasing on the live stream. And we realized what we learned from this really just random experiment was that when it comes to live video, there's something around the idea of anticipation that builds success. So once he did come in, our viewers actually dropped. They didn't really care about how he reacted. It was more about this shared experience with people all over the world of waiting for something to happen. And so after the success of this video, producers started playing around more with this idea, like, what are other ways that we can create this shared experience of anticipation? And of course, someone mentioned an idea about exploding a watermelon with rubber bands, and it turns out that was one of the most successful ideas. But again, that was also just another experiment in a series of experiments. It wasn't like the watermelon idea was like what we were going for or the final outcome. And we also, of course, we do this internally on the design team as well. So this is our email newsletter for news content. And as we were designing this, we would basically design a version and just push it live and get feedback on both social channels as well as quantitative feedback on who was opening, how many people were actually opening and going through the newsletter. And basically, it was kind of like designing in public, which is very anxiety-inducing. Sometimes you feel like, well, I don't know if I actually want to put this out there. I'm not ready. But basically, by getting feedback and data as early and often as possible helped us reach a better result faster. And so in the end, the pieces that I kind of want you guys to take away from this is that, for one, data is just information, and that information can be quantitative or qualitative. Sorry, it should say quantitative or qualitative up there. And also think about how you can use data to identify opportunity, especially if, like myself, you're not a data scientist, you might not be as experienced as it, and not ready to fully dive into this fully optimized world. You can still use data as a starting point for where to go next. And of course, and if you do care about data, try experimenting just to get things out there so you can get that feedback loop faster. And here are some resources. Again, if you're like me, not a data scientist, I'd recommend reading this book called Winning with Data. It's a really short read, just with several examples on how companies similar to BuzzFeed are using data to sort of achieve success. And once again, the emotional mapping concept, if you Google it, I believe his original slide deck is online, so you can just read through it. So yeah, thank you.